The setting sun bathed the Silver Spur diner in golden hues, its light stretching through the large windows and casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The air carried the familiar blend of sizzling burgers, fresh coffee, and the faint tang of old leather from the booths that had seen decades of customers pass through. The hum of conversation mixed with the occasional clatter of silverware, filling the space with a comfortable kind of chaos. Megan, 24, stood behind the counter, wiping a glass with a rag that had seen better days. Exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders after a long shift spent juggling impatient customers, forgotten orders, and measly tips. Her apron smelled like grease, and her patience had worn thin hours ago. She could already predict which tables would tip, and which would leave her with nothing but crumpled napkins. The diner door creaked open, and Megan barely glanced up. Another late-night customer, probably someone ordering a coffee to stretch out their stay without spending much. Danny, her co-worker and self-proclaimed diner philosopher, nudged her with a smirk. "You got table 7, Meg. Looks like a real cowboy just walked in." Megan sighed and grabbed her notepad, glancing toward the table in question. The man who had just entered was different from the usual late-night stragglers. He wore a faded flannel shirt, well-worn jeans, and a dusty felt hat that had seen its fair share of sun. His hands, rough and calloused, rested on the table as he surveyed the place with a calm, knowing gaze. She approached with her best waitress smile, polite but detached. "Evenin'. What can I get you?" The man looked up, and for a second, Megan felt something strange. His blue eyes were piercing yet patient, as if he saw straight through her mask of indifference. "Burger and a coffee, please." His voice was deep, slow, and deliberate, carrying the weight of experience. Megan scribbled down the order quickly and turned away, eager to put some distance between herself and whatever it was about him that made her uneasy. When she returned with his food, she placed the plate and cup on the table and slid the check toward him. "Here you go. Let me know if you need anything else." Instead of digging into his meal like most customers, he studied her. Then, with a knowing smile, he spoke. "Long day, huh?" Megan stiffened. "Excuse me." The man took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "I can see it in your eyes. The way you move, the way you talk to people. You're running on fumes." Annoyance flickered inside her. "Oh yeah. What, you got a psychology degree from a Texas saloon?" He chuckled, a deep, easy laugh. "Something like that. But mostly, I've just been around long enough to recognize things." Megan didn't know why that irritated her, but it did. "Well, thanks for the unsolicited life advice," she muttered, turning on her heel. Danny, who had been eavesdropping, slid up beside her with an amused grin. "Meg, you ever get the feeling you've seen someone before?" She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, Danny, that's how customers work. They come in, they eat, they leave." Danny chuckled. "No, I mean him. Something about him seems familiar." Megan shrugged. "He's just another old guy who's probably watched too many westerns." But as she went about her shift, she found herself glancing at the man more often than she'd like to admit. There was something about him, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. When he finished his meal, he wiped his mouth with a napkin and set down some cash. Megan walked over to collect it, expecting the usual spare change, but when she looked at the tip, her breath caught. It was more than usual, way more. Her eyes snapped to the door just as the man was heading out. That's when she heard a voice from the other side of the diner call out, "Clint, didn't know you were stopping by today." The words hit Megan like a truck. She turned slowly, heart pounding, just in time to see the man shake hands with the manager. He offered a small nod and a knowing smile before stepping out into the night. Clint. As in Clint Eastwood. Megan felt her stomach drop to the floor. She had just brushed off Clint Eastwood. And, worse, he knew it. Megan stood frozen, the weight of realization pressing down on her like a freight train. Clint Eastwood. She had just treated Clint Eastwood like an ordinary, penny-pinching customer, maybe even worse. Danny nudged her, his grin widening. "Meg, you just brushed off one of the biggest legends in Hollywood. This is gold." Megan barely heard him. Her eyes darted to the door, half expecting Clint to turn around, point a weathered finger at her, and say something cryptic, like he did in his movies. But he didn't. He just walked out into the cool night, his figure vanishing under the flickering neon lights of the Silver Spur Diner's sign. "You okay there?" Danny asked, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. Megan let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. I didn't know it was him. He didn't act famous." Danny chuckled. "What were you expecting? A cowboy hat and a 'do you feel lucky' punk?" "I don't know," Megan admitted. I basically told Clint Eastwood to shove his life advice." Danny whistled. "Yeah, that's a bold move. I mean, he's probably been in more shootouts than you've had bad shifts." Megan groaned, rubbing her temples. "Great, just great. The one time a famous person comes in, I act like a total jerk." "Look on the bright side," Danny said, smirking. "At least you didn't spill coffee on him, or call him an old cowboy straight to his face." Megan winced. "Yeah, let's not go down that road." The night dragged on, but Megan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that she had blown it. Whatever it was, she had been in customer service long enough to know that some encounters felt bigger than others, that certain moments had a way of lingering. And this one lingered. The next morning, Megan walked into the diner with a pit in her stomach. Sleep had been a restless mess, filled with half-formed dreams of Clint Eastwood staring her down from across the counter, his voice deep and unreadable as he told her she had failed some unspoken test. As she tied her apron, she muttered to herself, "He's not coming back. He's a Hollywood legend, not some guy who hangs out at diners. Get over it." But the moment she stepped onto the floor, her stomach flipped. Because there he was, sitting in the exact same booth as the night before, hands folded on the table, looking as calm as ever. Danny, who had been setting up the coffee machine, whistled low. Well, looks like you've got another shot, Meg. Round 2, don't screw it up." Megan swallowed hard, smoothing her apron as if that would help her nerves. This time, she wouldn't brush him off. This time, she'd handle it differently. She walked over, trying to keep her voice steady. "Good morning, Mr. Eastwood. Can I get you anything?" He looked up, his blue eyes sharp yet unreadable. "Just coffee. Thanks." Megan nodded quickly, hurrying to pour the cup with hands that, to her horror, were slightly shaking. She returned, setting it down carefully. "Here's your coffee." Clint took a slow sip, nodded approvingly, and then glanced up at her again. "So, how's today going?" It was such a simple question, but Megan felt caught off guard by how genuine it sounded. She hesitated, then gave an honest answer. "Better than yesterday, I think." Clint gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Good. Tough days happen to everyone. It's all about how you handle them." Megan bit her lip. "Yeah, I didn't exactly handle yesterday very well." Clint tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. No one gets it right all the time. For some reason, that made her exhale a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was steady, like a moment that didn't need to be rushed. Then, Clint spoke again, his voice just as calm but carrying a certain weight. "Tell me something. Do you like this job?" Megan blinked. Of all the things she expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. "What?" "Serving. The diner. Do you like it?" Megan opened her mouth to give a default polite answer, but stopped herself. She didn't know why, but something about Clint Eastwood asking that question made her want to tell the truth. She glanced around. At the customers sipping coffee, at Danny joking with one of the regulars, at the faded red booths that had been there longer than she had been alive. Some days, yeah. Some days, not so much. Clint nodded, as if he had expected that answer. That's how you know it's real. Anything worth doing has its good and bad days. Megan frowned slightly. You really think that, even with your career? Clint leaned back slightly, considering her question. Especially with my career. The difference is whether you let the bad days make you bitter, or if you learn something from them. Megan let his words sink in. Something about them felt important, like she wasn't just talking to a movie star, but someone who had lived enough life to actually know what he was saying. Clint finished his coffee, pulled out a few bills, and set them neatly on the table. See you around, Megan. Then, with the same quiet ease as the night before, he stood, adjusted his hat, and walked out the door. Megan stood there, feeling like she had just been handed something valuable, something she couldn't quite define yet. Danny walked over, shaking his head in disbelief. Meg, you just had a heart-to-heart with Clint freaking Eastwood. I don't know what kind of weird movie you're living in, but I want in. Megan ignored him, still staring at the door. For the first time in a long time, she felt something shift inside her. Because maybe, just maybe, she wasn't stuck in place after all. Maybe this was just the beginning of something bigger. Megan couldn't shake the conversation from her mind. As she wiped down the counter later that morning, her thoughts kept drifting back to Clint Eastwood's words. Anything worth doing has its good and bad days. She'd heard plenty of generic life advice before, customers leaving empty platitudes about working hard or keeping a smile on her face. But this had felt different. Clint wasn't just talking. He had lived it. Danny leaned against the soda machine, watching her. You look like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Megan sighed, setting the cloth down. It's just weird, talking to him. I mean, he sees things in a way that makes you stop and think. Danny smirked. Well, that's what happens when you spend decades being the coolest man on screen. She rolled her eyes, but a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It's more than that, though. He asked if I liked my job, and I didn't have an answer ready. Danny shrugged. Do you? Megan hesitated, glancing around the diner. The place was familiar, almost comforting, but it was also a cage she had never quite figured out how to escape. Some days, yeah, but other days, I feel stuck. Before Danny could respond, the bell above the diner's door jingled. Megan turned, half expecting to see Clint again. Instead, a frazzled mother stepped in, struggling to keep hold of her toddler, who was bouncing with boundless energy. Megan sighed and grabbed a couple of crayons from the counter, walking over to the table before the mother even had to ask. Here, she said, placing them down with a small smile. This might keep him entertained for a bit. The woman looked up, exhausted but grateful. Thank you. You have no idea how much that helps. Megan shrugged. I think I do. As she walked back to the counter, Danny gave her a knowing look. Stuck, huh? Because that didn't look like someone who hates their job. Megan exhaled sharply. It's not that I hate it. I just feel like there should be more, you know. Like this can't be it forever. Danny nodded. Maybe it's not about whether this job is your final destination. Maybe it's about what you're supposed to learn from it. Megan blinked. Since when did you get all philosophical? Since Clint Eastwood started coming here for coffee. She laughed, shaking her head. Maybe he's rubbing off on us. The lunch rush hit soon after, and Megan fell into the usual rhythm of serving customers, refilling coffee, and exchanging small talk. But the shift in her perspective was subtle yet present. She started paying attention, not just to orders or tips, but to people. Their expressions, their gestures, the way they carried their day's burdens into the diner with them. And for the first time in a while, she didn't just feel like she was serving people. She felt like she was seeing them. That night, after closing, she sat at one of the booths, staring at the empty diner. The neon sign outside flickered against the glass, casting the room in an uneven glow. She traced the rim of her coffee cup, deep in thought. Maybe Danny was right. Maybe Clint was right, too. Maybe this job wasn't about being stuck. Maybe it was about learning how to move forward. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she thought she was. The next few days at the diner passed in a blur, but Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just that she had served Clint Eastwood twice. It was the way his words had lingered, sticking in the back of her mind like a song she couldn't turn off. Late one evening, just as the dinner rush began to slow, the bell above the door chimed. Megan instinctively glanced up from behind the counter, her breath catching for half a second. Clint Eastwood was back. This time, he didn't head straight for his usual booth. Instead, he paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room with the calm precision of someone taking in every detail. He moved like a man who had all the time in the world. Danny, standing beside her, let out a low whistle. Round 3. Think you'll mess it up again. Megan shot him a glare before straightening her apron. Not a chance. She made her way over to his table, her steps more confident this time. Good evening, Mr. Eastwood. Coffee? He glanced up, the faintest trace of a smirk tugging at his lips. You're learning. She set the coffee cup down carefully. I try. Clint wrapped his hands around the warm cup but didn't take a sip right away. Instead, he looked at her with that same unreadable expression. You thinking about what we talked about? Megan hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yeah, more than I expected to. Clint nodded slowly, as if he had already known the answer. That's good. Means you're paying attention. Megan shifted her weight, glancing at the diner around her. The faded walls, the hum of the coffee machine, the quiet conversations that filled the space. I've been trying to see this place differently, trying to see what I can learn from it. Clint took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. And she exhaled. Some days, it feels like I'm just going through the motions. But other times, I notice things I didn't before. The way people come in here carrying their whole day with them. How a simple cup of coffee or a kind word can change someone's mood. A small smile ghosted over Clint's face. That's a start. Megan frowned slightly. But what if it's not enough? What if I want more? Clint leaned back, considering her words. Then you figure out what more looks like for you. And you work toward it. But you don't ignore what's in front of you while you do. Megan chewed on that thought. She had spent so much time feeling stuck that she hadn't considered that maybe she wasn't stuck at all. Maybe she just hadn't been looking in the right direction. The diner door opened again, and a new wave of customers trickled in. Megan straightened up, instinctively ready to move. Clint noticed and gave her a knowing nod. Go on. Work's not gonna wait. She turned to leave, but something made her pause. Mr. Eastwood. He looked up, raising an eyebrow. Why do you keep coming back? She asked. A slow, amused smile spread across his face. Maybe I just like the coffee. Megan let out a soft laugh. Somehow. I doubt that. Clint didn't confirm or deny it. He just lifted his cup in a quiet toast before taking another sip. As Megan walked away, she felt lighter, more aware. Maybe she hadn't figured everything out yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. And somehow, she had a feeling Clint Eastwood would be back again. The morning air carried the scent of fresh coffee and crisp toast as Megan tied her apron, stepping onto the diner floor with a newfound awareness. The hum of conversation, the clatter of silverware, it all felt different now, more alive. She wasn't just another server moving through the motions. she was part of something, even if she hadn't quite figured out what that meant yet. She glanced at Clint's usual booth. Empty. A part of her had expected him to be there, coffee in hand, delivering another perfectly timed piece of wisdom. But today, it was just another day. Danny slid past her, balancing a tray of pancakes. What's with the look? Expecting another deep conversation with Hollywood royalty. Megan smirked, rolling her eyes. No, just thinking. Dangerous habit, Danny teased. Careful, you might start enjoying this job. Megan chuckled but didn't argue, because maybe, just maybe, Danny wasn't wrong. Mid-morning, a new customer wandered in. An older man with tired eyes and hands that had seen their share of hard work. He hesitated by the door before making his way to the counter, settling onto a stool. Megan approached with a smile. Morning. What can I get you? The man glanced up, seemingly surprised by the warmth in her voice. Just coffee, thanks. She poured a fresh cup, setting it in front of him. Rough morning. He exhaled, shaking his head. Long night. Some days just feel heavier than others. Megan nodded. Yeah, I get that. The man studied her for a moment, then chuckled. You sound too young to be carrying that kind of wisdom. Megan shrugged, thinking back to Clint and his quiet lessons. Just been paying attention more lately. Turns out, people have a lot to teach if you're willing to listen. The man nodded, as if her words carried weight. That's rare. Most people just wait for their turn to talk. Danny, passing by, gave her a pointed look. And yet Megan here has somehow turned listening into an art form. Megan swatted his arm, laughing. Ignore him. He thrives on sarcasm. The older man smiled for the first time since he walked in. Well, sarcasm aside, thanks for the coffee. And the conversation. Sometimes, that's all a person needs. Megan watched as he sipped his drink, the weight on his shoulders seeming just a little lighter. She walked back toward the counter, a strange feeling settling in her chest. Maybe Clint had been right all along. Maybe every encounter was an opportunity, not just for the customers, but for her too. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally beginning to understand what that meant. The diner was quieter than usual that evening. The post-dinner crowd had thinned out, leaving only a few stragglers nursing their coffee or chatting in hushed tones. Megan wiped down the counter, her movements slower, more thoughtful than before. The past few days had changed something in her, even if she couldn't quite put it into words. Then the bell above the door jingled. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. There was a certain presence to him, an energy that shifted the air. Still, she glanced toward the entrance, confirming what she already knew. Clint Eastwood had returned. This time, he didn't head straight for his usual booth. Instead, he walked toward the counter, settling onto one of the stools. His hat rested beside him, and his expression was the same as always. Calm, unreadable, but with a hint of amusement in his eyes. Megan smirked, grabbing the coffee pot. I was starting to think you'd moved on to another diner. Clint chuckled. Didn't want to make it too easy for you. She poured his coffee, setting the cup in front of him. So, what's the lesson today? He raised an eyebrow. Lesson? Megan shrugged. Every time you walk in here, you leave me with something to think about. So, what is it this time? Clint stirred his coffee, taking a slow sip before answering. Maybe today, it's your turn to figure that out. Megan leaned against the counter, crossing her arms, cryptic as ever. He smiled but didn't say more. Instead, he sat back, observing the room the way he always did, as if he saw something no one else could. After a long moment, he spoke again. You still feel stuck? Megan hesitated. The answer wasn't as simple as it had been before. I don't know. Maybe less than before. Clint nodded as if that was the answer he expected. Good. That means you're paying attention. She exhaled, shaking her head. I swear, talking to you is like reading one of those fortune cookies that makes too much sense. Clint chuckled again, setting his cup down. Life's full of little lessons. The trick is knowing when to listen. Megan thought about that as she wiped down the counter again, her mind drifting over the past week. The conversations, the small changes, the realization that maybe she wasn't as lost as she thought she was. Maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she needed to be for now. As Clint stood to leave, he placed a few bills on the counter, pausing before picking up his hat. See you around, Megan. She smiled, watching him go. Yeah, see you around. And for the first time in a long time, she meant it. Megan had always thought of the diner as a place where time stood still. The same red booths, the same flickering neon sign, the same scent of coffee lingering in the air. But now, something felt different. Maybe it was her, maybe she had changed. She found herself looking forward to work in a way she hadn't before. Instead of just moving through the motions, she started noticing things. The way regulars had their little habits, how a well-placed joke from Danny could turn a customer's whole day around, how a cup of coffee served with genuine kindness could mean more than just caffeine. Clint hadn't been back since their last conversation, but his words stayed with her. She thought about them every time she hesitated, every time she found herself wondering what was next. He had pushed her to ask the right questions, even if he didn't hand her the answers. Late one evening, as the last of the dinner crowd filtered out, Megan was wiping down the counter when she heard a voice behind her. Still figuring things out. She turned and found Clint standing in the doorway, his hat tilted slightly, that same knowing expression on his face. She smirked, tossing the rag over her shoulder. You're making a habit of this. Clint walked over, taking his usual seat at the counter. Gotta keep you on your toes. Megan poured him a coffee without asking. So, what's the lesson tonight? Clint took a slow sip before answering. No lesson. Just checking in. Megan leaned on the counter. Really? No wise words, no cryptic advice. He chuckled. You don't need it anymore. She frowned, considering his words. I don't. Clint set his cup down and met her gaze. You're paying attention now. That's all that matters. Megan let the thought settle. She had spent so much time waiting for something to change, never realizing that change had already started within her. She smiled, shaking her head. You know, for a guy who doesn't talk much, you say a lot. Clint smirked. That's the trick. The diner fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Megan looked around, feeling more at home here than she had in a long time. As Clint stood to leave, she called after him. You'll be back, won't you? He paused, adjusting his hat. Maybe, but you don't need me to be. She watched him walk out, the door swinging shut behind him. And for the first time, she didn't feel stuck. She felt ready. Ready for whatever came next. The diner felt different, even though nothing had really changed. The same customers filled the booths, the same coffee brewed in the back, and the same neon sign flickered outside. But Megan knew it wasn't the place that had shifted. It was her. She moved with more purpose now, noticing things she hadn't before. The way Mr. Thompson tapped his fingers on the table when he was deep in thought. How Linda, the nurse who always came in after her shift, liked her coffee 2 sugars, no cream. Even Danny's sarcasm had a rhythm to it, something predictable in the chaos of the diner. For the first time in a long time, Megan felt like she belonged. One evening, as she was wiping down the counter, Danny leaned in smirking. So, you finally made peace with this place, huh? She glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. What makes you say that? He shrugged. I don't know. You actually seem to be enjoying yourself. It's weird. Megan rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. I guess I stopped seeing this as a dead end. Danny nodded, watching her for a moment. "So, what's next?" Megan paused. That was the question, wasn't it? Before, she had always thought next meant escaping. Getting out of this town, this job, this life. But now, she wasn't so sure. "I don't know," she admitted. "But for the first time, I'm okay with that." Danny smirked. "Well, that's terrifying." She laughed, shaking her head. Yeah, just take my shift tomorrow if you're so concerned." "Nice try." As the night wound down, Megan glanced toward the door, half expecting to see Clint walk in. But he didn't. And that was okay. She didn't need him to come back to remind her what she had learned. She had already figured it out. Stepping outside after closing, she took a deep breath of the cool night air. The world stretched out before her, full of possibilities she hadn't considered before. Maybe she'd stay. Maybe she'd leave. Maybe she'd figure it out along the way. But whatever happened next, she was ready. Want more inspiring stories? Subscribe to Iconic Stories and stay tuned for more.